When history calls, some nations whisper, and others rise with a thunder that shakes the earth. India did not step timidly into that hour it leapt. With the courage of 1 billion beating hearts, it showed the world that silence can turn to roar, and patience can turn to power. What happened was not just a strike of strategy. It was a strike of spirit, a reminder that dignity is never given, it is claimed. India stood tall, not as a shadow of another nation, but as the flame of its own destiny. The truth of this statement lies in the way India has carried centuries of history on her shoulders. For too long, she was seen through the lens of others, through colonial eyes, through economic measurements, through comparisons with powers that had risen earlier on the world stage. But when the moment came, India did not hesitate. She reminded the globe that her strength is not borrowed, her voice is not an echo, and her destiny is not tied to the ambitions of another. Instead, she rose as herself, clothed in the dignity of her own struggles, victories, and dreams. This standing tall was not just about politics or defense. It was the culmination of thousands of years of civilization, where resilience became second nature. Empires came and went, conquerors left their mark and disappeared, but India remained, transforming wounds into wisdom, turning oppression into endurance. In the modern moment, when the world thought she would remain quiet, she showed that the patience of her people was not weakness, but preparation. The strike that reverberated across the oceans was not a sudden burst of pride. It was the release of a strength that had been tested, tempered, and honed by centuries of surviving and thriving against odds. The world often measures nations in terms of power, nuclear capability, economic size, alliances, and influence in global chambers. But India, in that hour, proved that power is more than weapons or wealth. Power is belief. Power is the courage to say enough. Power is the will to rise, even when doubted, dismissed, or underestimated. India's action spoke louder than 1,000 speeches, because it told the world that no matter the size of the adversary, no matter the weight of global opinion, a nation that stands for its dignity can never be ignored. And this dignity was not only for the leaders or the soldiers who carried out the mission. It was for the ordinary people, the millions who rise every morning with the hope of a better tomorrow. Every farmer tilling his land, every student chasing knowledge, every worker building the nation's future. Each one was represented in that single act of assertion. For them, it was not just a strike of force. It was the proof that their nation was no longer a silent participant in history, but an active author of it. Standing tall also meant refusing to bow to fear. It is easy for nations to hide behind diplomacy, to avoid confrontation, to silence themselves in the name of peace. But peace without self-respect is nothing but quiet slavery. India chose differently. She chose to show that true peace comes only when others know you will defend it, that dialogue is meaningful only when backed by strength. By standing tall, India set a new tone, not just for her relationship with America, but for her role in the global order. The beauty of this rise was that it was not meant to threaten, but to awaken. The message was not "we are against you," but "we are here, strong and unafraid." It was a reminder to the world that India's destiny cannot be shaped by external hands, that her future cannot be scripted by others. It was her declaration of arrival, a declaration that from now on, no decision of global importance can be made without considering her voice. This was more than a geopolitical maneuver. It was the birth of a renewed identity, a nation standing in the light of its own courage, in the dignity of its own truth, refusing to be measured as an extension of anyone else. It was the flame of destiny burning bright, reminding every Indian and every observer around the world that strength does not ask for permission. It simply rises and demands recognition. The strike was not merely military, it was moral. In its essence, it was a message that some lines cannot be crossed, some principles cannot be traded, and some values cannot be compromised. India's action was not only about defending territory, but about upholding the sacred idea of sovereignty. When a nation is tested, it has two choices: yield quietly or stand firmly. India chose to stand, and in that stance she spoke for every people in the world who have ever felt that their dignity was at risk, their security under threat, or their freedom in danger. What made this act powerful was that it was not born of arrogance but of necessity. The soil of a people is not merely land. It is memory, heritage, sacrifice, and belonging. When that soil is attacked, it is not just a military act. It is an attempt to wound the spirit of a nation. India responded with clarity, showing that no force, no matter how intimidating, has the right to diminish her sovereignty. This was not aggression for dominance, but courage for protection. It was an act rooted not in hatred, but in responsibility, to safeguard what millions call home. The morality of that strike lay in the reminder that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of justice. Without justice, peace is fragile, temporary, and hollow. India's response demonstrated that peace built on fear is no peace at all. True peace comes when every nation knows that its sovereignty will be defended, that its dignity will not be compromised. The strike was therefore not only a lesson for those who tested her, but also an inspiration for others who watch from afar, struggling to find their own voices against larger powers. The action carried weight because it reflected restraint as much as strength. For years, India had been patient, often choosing dialogue over confrontation, negotiation over escalation. Yet patience cannot be mistaken for passivity. When pushed too far, patience becomes principle, and principle becomes action. That was the moral foundation of the strike, that no nation should allow its goodwill to be abused, nor its silence to be exploited. India reminded the world that a nation's responsibility is not only to talk about peace, but to ensure it through decisive action when required. In that moment, India also taught an unspoken lesson about courage. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. There were risks, consequences, and global eyes fixed on her every move. Yet she acted, because to do otherwise would be to betray the trust of her people. Every mother who sends her child to the border, every family that sacrifices for the defense of the nation, was honored by that act of moral courage. It told them that their sacrifices were not in vain, that their nation values their devotion by ensuring their soil remains secure. The moral power of the strike extended beyond borders. It echoed to nations that had long been told to stay silent, to accept their fate, to live in the shadows of stronger powers. It showed them that dignity does not depend on size or wealth. It depends on will. A smaller nation with determination can hold its head high, while a larger one without courage can crumble under pressure. India became an example, not by words but by deeds, that sovereignty is sacred and must be defended, not begged for. That action was not about war, but about reminding the world that peace without respect is hollow, and diplomacy without justice is fragile. It was a lesson wrapped in courage, teaching that sovereignty is not negotiable, and that moral clarity can be more powerful than military might. By striking not just with arms but with purpose, India showed the world that the greatest strength of a nation lies not in its weapons, but in its will to protect what is rightfully its own. And to America the echo was clear. India is no longer a voice to be dismissed in global chambers. For decades, international dialogues were shaped by a select few, and India was often seen as a listener rather than a leader, a participant rather than a shaper of narratives. But in that moment the dynamic shifted. India did not wait for recognition, nor did she ask for validation. She asserted herself with action, reminding the United States and the wider world that the age of overlooking her influence had come to an end. This was not a cry for attention, but a statement of presence. For far too long, global strategies were written with India on the margins, as if her voice could be softened, her aspirations delayed. Yet the strike shattered that illusion, proving that India does not need to knock on the doors of power. She has built her own. To America, this was a revelation. Here stood a partner, a competitor, a rising force who would not be silent in matters of global consequence. India's act was not against America, but it reverberated in Washington because it altered the calculus of power. America, long accustomed to leading the world stage, realized that India was no longer content with a supporting role. She was crafting her own script, writing her own destiny, and demanding that others take notice. When a nation demonstrates such clarity of purpose, it compels even the most established powers to adjust their perspective. That adjustment is not just about policy, it is about respect. The echo that reached America was also moral. It reminded the superpower that strength is not monopolized, that wisdom does not belong only to the West, and that courage does not come only from wealth. India proved that determination and dignity can elevate a nation into the global spotlight as surely as military or economic might. The lesson for America was unmistakable. To truly lead in the 21st century, it must treat India not as a follower, but as an equal. For the Indian people, this recognition was more than symbolic. It carried the weight of centuries in which they had been spoken about, studied and analyzed, but rarely spoken to as equals. Now the world's most powerful nation had to listen, had to acknowledge, had to reconsider its place at the table where India's chair was no longer empty, no longer offered by courtesy, but claimed by right. This was empowerment not given, but earned, and it reshaped the balance of global diplomacy. America, known for its influence in shaping international order, faced a new reality. The order itself is shifting. India is no longer emerging. It has emerged. Its strike was not a declaration of hostility, but a declaration of arrival. The old narrative of dependency, of waiting for recognition, was discarded. In its place rose a new identity, confident, assertive, and indispensable. The ripple of this moment spread far beyond America. Other nations observed closely, watching how the United States would respond to a rising India that could no longer be overlooked. Would America adapt and embrace India as an equal partner? Would it resist an attempt to diminish her role? Whatever the choice, the fact remained. India had forced recognition through action. No longer in the background, she was now at the center, shaping conversations that would define the century. This was not about rivalry. It was about reality. The reality that the future of diplomacy, security, and global progress cannot be scripted without India's voice. America heard the echo of that strike, not as a warning, but as a call to awaken. It was the call of a nation standing with confidence, no longer asking to be heard, but ensuring that silence was no longer possible. India had announced herself on the world stage, and even the mightiest could not turn away from the sound of that truth. To the world, it was a tremor of awakening. Nations near and far saw in India's action a lesson written not in books but in courage. They witnessed a country that had long been underestimated, suddenly taking a step that forced even the most powerful to pause. It was not the strike alone that stirred the earth. It was the will behind it. The message was clear. Strength is not found solely in arsenals or in wealth, but in the spirit of a people who refuse to bow, in the determination of a nation that believes in its rightful place among equals. For decades, the world had looked at India with mixed perceptions. Some saw her as a land of history and spirituality, others as a developing economy with vast potential but limited influence. Many admired her resilience, but few considered her capable of shaping global strategy. That perception began to shift in an instant. The tremor was not only about defense, it was about redefining how India would be seen. She was no longer the quiet observer of international debates. She was now a participant who had proven she could act decisively when the stakes demanded. This awakening rippled through capitals across continents. Small nations, often silenced by the dominance of larger powers, found inspiration in India's resolve. They saw in her an example that dignity can be defended, that size does not determine courage, and that a nation's will can be stronger than its adversaries' might. For them, India's action was not just an event in geopolitics. It was hope, a reminder that they too could claim respect if they stood firm for their sovereignty. Larger powers, meanwhile, were compelled to reevaluate their assumptions. They had long engaged with India as a partner in trade, as a player in regional stability, as a vast market for influence. But now they had to see her as something more, an independent force that could shape outcomes beyond her borders. The tremor they felt was a shift in the balance of respect. No longer could they plan strategies in South Asia or the Indo-Pacific without considering India's role. No longer could they ignore her voice in matters of security and global order. The awakening was not about aggression, but about recognition. This new awareness was also rooted in India's restraint. The strike showed strength, but it also showed discipline. It was not reckless or aimless. It was calculated, purposeful, and precise. The world understood that India was not seeking domination, but demanding dignity. This balance of courage and control set her apart, reminding everyone that true power is not in excess, but in measured action. By striking with purpose rather than fury, India showed the world that her rise would not be chaotic, but deliberate and principled. The tremor reached not only governments, but people. Across the globe, ordinary citizens watched the headlines, and many felt admiration for a nation that chose to protect its sovereignty with clarity. Some saw a reflection of their own struggles for respect. Others saw an example of emerging strength in a world where dominance had often been dictated by only a few powers. India became a symbol not of conquest but of courage, the courage to stand when silence would have been easier, the courage to act when hesitation would have been safer. In that moment, the world's map did not change in lines or borders, but it shifted in perception. India had announced that she would no longer be judged by the shadows of others, but by the light of her own determination. Nations near and far felt the tremor because it was not just India rising. It was the reminder that the global stage belongs to all who have the courage to claim their place upon it. And to her own children, India gave a gift greater than victory, the gift of pride. It was not the kind of pride that boasts or shouts, but the kind that settles deep within the heart, steady and unshakable. For too long, ordinary citizens had carried the weight of being underestimated, told by the world that their nation was rising but not yet risen, developing but not yet developed, strong but not yet powerful. The strike changed that narrative in an instant. It told every Indian, no matter where they stood or what they did, that their country was no longer standing at the threshold of greatness. It had already walked through the door. This pride was not abstract. It belonged to the farmer working under the sun, who now knew that the land he tills is defended with courage. It belonged to the teacher in a small village classroom, who could tell her students that their nation's voice cannot be silenced on the global stage. It belonged to the soldier on the border, who saw his sacrifice honored not only in speeches but in decisive action. It belonged to the millions in cities, towns, and villages who had long dreamed of a day when India would not only demand respect but command it. What the strike gave them was not just a moment of national unity, but a sense of belonging to a story larger than themselves. Too often, the lives of ordinary citizens are disconnected from the decisions made in corridors of power. But this was different. This was a moment where the will of the nation aligned with the will of its people. They saw in the strike a reflection of their own struggles, the determination to stand tall despite challenges, the refusal to surrender to circumstances, the courage to rise after being underestimated. That alignment created pride because it was not borrowed from another. It was earned through India's own strength. Pride is powerful because it changes how people see themselves. When a nation is made to feel weak or dependent, its people often carry that burden into their own lives. But when a nation shows that it can act with dignity and courage, its people stand taller too. The strike lifted the confidence of 1 billion hearts. It reminded students that their future is not small, entrepreneurs that their ventures are not insignificant, artists that their voices matter, and workers that their labor contributes to a nation capable of shaping its own destiny. This pride also extended beyond borders. Indians living abroad felt their heads lift higher. No longer were they asked to explain their country as emerging someday. Instead, they could point to action that proved India had already arrived. The diaspora, spread across continents, felt a surge of belonging, a deeper connection to the motherland that had spoken with courage on behalf of them all. Pride bridged the distance of oceans and carried a shared identity across the world. But this pride was not about arrogance. It was about recognition of sacrifices made in the past, recognition of struggles endured, recognition of dreams carried from generation to generation. It was about honoring the forefathers who had envisioned an India free, strong, and respected. It was about showing today's youth that those dreams were not lost in the dust of history, but alive in the present, embodied in decisive moments like this. The gift of pride is lasting because it does not fade with headlines. It lives in the daily lives of the people who now believe more deeply in their own strength. Every achievement, every small success, feels connected to a larger story of a nation that proved its worth. That pride will inspire them to work harder, dream bigger, and walk taller, not only for themselves, but for India, the nation that gave them a reason to never bow their heads in shame, only to raise them in dignity.